Good afternoon. Welcome to Congress 212. My name is Mike Carroll. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at Wilfrid Laurier University. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the latest in our series of big thinking lectures. I do have to thank the Canadian Federation of the Humanities and Social Sciences for selecting the University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier to co-host Congress this year. And in that vein, I want to thank Dr. Feridun Hamdulapur, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Waterloo, and Dr. Max Blau, President and Vice Chancellor of Wilfrid Laurier University, for their roles in advancing the partnership opportunity that Congress has created for our two institutions. And with that, I would now like to introduce P.G. Forrest of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation to begin the process of introducing today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Carroll, dear friends, dear colleagues. Merci beaucoup. I'm very honored to be here today and to see the rich and diverse composition of the audience. I'm sure this is precisely the kind of cross-section of intellectual communities and interests the founders of the Trudeau Foundation had in mind when they established our organization. The foundation was designed to make meaningful contributions to crucial social issues through scholarships, fellowships, mentorships, and public interaction events like this one today. Some of you may already know about the Trudeau Foundation. It was established in 2001 by the family, friends, and colleagues of the former Prime Minister as a living memorial. It received an endowment of $125 million from the Government of Canada in 2002 to further honor its humanitarian spirit, but despite its namesake, the Foundation has no political agenda. It is an independent and non-partisan Canadian charity committed to society's advancement. La Fondation Trudeau est un réseau interdisciplinaire, intergénérationnel, international, qui réunit des esprits libres, qui mettent leur créativité et leur talent au service de la société. Notre mission consiste à faciliter la pénétration dans la sphère publique des grandes idées inspirées par la recherche. Nous voulons que les innovations dans la pensée rejoignent les pratiques les plus concrètes. Nous espérons que les solutions globales trouveront leur chemin jusqu'aux problèmes locaux. Pierre Elliott Trudeau était profondément attaché à la notion de bien commun. Il croyait qu'il était de notre devoir de créer une société juste, humaine, généreuse. Il n'a eu de cesse de nous convaincre d'aborder de front des problèmes comme la discrimination, les inégalités, le terrorisme ou la dégradation de l'environnement. Trudeau challenged us to confront these critical issues and I quote, be able to face our children and assure them that we did not lack the courage to face these difficult questions, did not lack the stamina to pursue the correct solutions. At the Trudeau Foundation, we have taken up this challenge by supporting some of the best minds in the country and from around the planet. A granting agency, we reward and support research excellence in the social sciences and the humanities. We actively seek exceptional individuals who believe in the possibility of change and who have the potential to make a difference. Each year, we select up to 5 fellows who have contributed to the enhancement of knowledge through leading-edge research and the conscientious attention they pay to the needs of society. Trudeau Fellows focus their studies on 4 key themes espoused by Pierre Trudeau: human rights and dignity, responsible citizenship, Canada in the world, and people in the natural environment. Tous les lauréats Trudeau sont des penseurs doués et profonds qui se sont distingués à la fois dans la sphère des idées et dans celle de l'engagement social. Pour dire autrement, des lauréats comme Janine Brodie et Anne Dale ont été reconnus par la Fondation parce qu'ils avaient prouvé qu'ils pouvaient imaginer et promouvoir des solutions originales aux grands problèmes de notre temps. In 2008, the Foundation initiated the Trudeau Lectures to accelerate the circulation of our fellows' ideas. We wanted to bring their research findings to a wider audience across the country so this knowledge could permeate Canadian society. In a world facing more challenges than solutions, the generation and application of new ideas is of the utmost importance to Canadians and the world community. En fait, nous sommes convaincus que la Fondation Trudeau peut jouer un rôle déterminant dans la dissémination et la promotion d'idées et de connaissances nouvelles en accord avec les aspirations des Canadiens et des Canadiennes. Indeed, we are confident that by fostering fruitful dialogue, among academics and policymakers in the art business, government, the professions, and the voluntary sector, we can bring transformative ideas to the fore that will bring about positive change. The proof is evident in today's Trudeau lecture. As you will hear in today's presentation, Canada is rich with creative thinkers who can point societies in new and better directions. I encourage you to open your minds and your hearts to benefit fully from this fourth Trudeau lecture of 2012 as we learn how together we can build a better country and world for us all. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. I will now ask my excellent colleague, Graham Carr, Professor Graham Carr, who is the president of the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and the Social Sciences, to introduce our today's speaker. Thank you.
Bon après-midi tout le monde. Merci PG pour ces mots d'accueil. Je suis Graham Carr, président de la Fédération canadienne des sciences humaines, et j'aimerais signaler avant de commencer que la traduction simultanée est assurée pour cette conférence. Vous pouvez retirer les écouteurs dans la halle située à l'extérieur de la salle de théâtre. Nous sommes très heureux d'avoir pu nous associer encore une fois à la Fondation Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, the Pierre-Elliott Trudeau Foundation, pour vous présenter cette conférence Voix grande. La Fondation Trudeau est un partenaire important pour amener à découvrir des personnalités de premier plan dans un grand spectre de disciplines et pour le rôle déterminant qu'elles tiennent dans le soutien et le mentorat de chercheurs de grand talent qui s'affirment au Canada. I'd also like to thank our partners at the Association for Universities and Colleges of Canada for making community participation possible at this year's Big Thinking events, and the Canada Foundation for Innovation for sponsoring the speakers series. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Trudeau Fellow Janine Brodie for this Big Thinking lecture. Dr. Brodie holds the Canada Research Chair in Political Economy and Social Governance at the University of Alberta, where she also holds the title of Distinguished University Professor. In her distinguished career, Dr. Brodie has held faculty positions at Queen's University and at York University, where she was the first Director of Feminist Research and held the John Robarts Chair in Canadian Studies. She has also been a visiting fellow at the University of Western Ontario. As I'm sure many of you in the audience know, she is the author, co-author, or editor of more than a dozen books and literally dozens of journal articles and book chapters. She is also the mentor to a number of graduate students, an important element of the Trudeau mission of the Trudeau Foundation. And she is certainly no stranger to giving keynote lectures. Her research has critically engaged many pressing issues surrounding Canadian politics and public policy, from citizenship to gender equity and equality to globalization. As an author and editor, Dr. Brodie has made vital contributions to Canadian policy dialogue and development. Nous sommes tellement honorés de sa présence parmi nous aujourd'hui. Veuillez vous joindre à moi pour saluer Madame Janine Brodie.
Thank you, Graham. I'd like to begin my lecture by thanking the Trudeau Foundation and the Canadian Federation of the Humanities and Social Sciences for inviting me to participate in the 2012 Big Thinking Lecture Series. The question of scholarship for an uncertain world, this year's theme, is a pressing one for us all. This is an uncertain world, which is unsettled by multiple and overlapping crises: economic, political, social, environmental. And this is also an insecure world, fearful of unemployment, of losing ground, of being unable to make ends meet, and above all, fearful that our governments don't understand. These crises are typically the research terrain of the humanities and social sciences, but increasingly our vocations are under attack within our universities, by governments, and in the popular media. Social innovators, social scientists, equity seekers, all have been relegated to the sidelines of policy debates and their arguments dismissed as unscientific, self-interested, and a threat to economic growth. But it seems to me that the genie is out of the bottle. The contemporary assault on social knowledge is part and parcel of the crisis that most advanced democracies are experiencing now. The social sciences and humanities find themselves in a unique intellectual and political space that we have not seen probably since the Great Depression. Then, as now, scholarship for an uncertain world is charged with giving meaning to the crisis, exposing the myths that lurk in the shadows of common sense, and pointing to ways to more equitable and sustainable futures. So, by way of a roadmap, my lecture is divided into 4 parts. I want to first explore the nature, or some parts of the natures, of our uncertain world. Second, I want to discuss what I call social ways of seeing. Third, I want to focus on what I call the active production of social illiteracy. And finally, I'll return to the theme of this conference, scholarship for an uncertain world. So starting with an uncertain world. We are now 5 years into the longest, deepest, and most widespread economic contraction since the 1930s. Like people in the 1930s, we stare into what Franklin Roosevelt then called a vast frontier of insecurity. And like our predecessors, we simply do not know when, how, or what kind of recovery will eventually gain traction. We've had massive public bailouts of the private sector, hefty public borrowing to stimulate the economy, rounds of tax cuts primarily to the rich and corporations, plus historically low interest rates, and yes, now, austerity programs. But there are depressingly few signs of recovery. When the global economy began to tank with the American mortgage crisis, there was a loud public clamor demanding that the perpetrators be held accountable. Governments, went the cry, should regulate the financial sector to prevent future global crises. And again, like the 1930s, governments ignored the growing liabilities of the prevailing system, preferring instead to treat the Great Recession as a temporary setback. G20 leaders implemented a series of restoration strategies designed to get on with business as usual. But business has been far from usual. So-called green shoots of the recovery have withered on the vine, and an ill-contained European debt crisis teeters on the brink of what the head of the IMF obliquely calls a 1930s moment. Now, many Canadians feel shielded somewhat from the worst consequences of the Great Recession, but Canada is neither protected nor immune. In fact, Canada has many of the precarious markers of this era. Income inequality is growing here more quickly than in the United States and now surpasses levels set in the 1920s. Personal debt has never been higher. Savings have never been lower. And underemployment and unemployment are stubbornly high, especially in former manufacturing hubs, among the young, racial minorities, and newcomers. Our youth face a future without the promise of social mobility. Our youth are less likely than their parents' generation to earn a decent wage, to have a secure job, employment benefits, or indeed to own a home. In his recent book, End This Depression Now, Nobel laureate Paul Krugman argues that advanced economies are now mired in a depression. Perhaps not a full replay of the Great Depression of the 1930s, but qualitatively similar to that last lost decade. Krugman finds similarities in the depth and hardship that have been exacted on working people, in the duration of the crisis, in the wrong-headedness of official thinking. Krugman appeals to governments to be mindful of the lessons that were learned in the 1930s, especially that austerity programs only make things worse. Instead, he said, of squeezing budgets, governments should focus on creating jobs and public infrastructure. Last month, the IMF also warned governments to go easy on austerity. The current era is also similar to the 1930s and eerily so in other important respects as well. Karl Polanyi wrote The Great Transformation in 1943. It was a telling analysis of the rise of European fascism and the Great Depression in Europe. He argues that market governance was always a utopian experiment that tore away at the human and natural substance of society. Inevitably, Polanyi said, society took measures to protect itself. In the dying days of laissez-faire, there was a spontaneous eruption of all manner of counter-movements, ranging from communism to fascism to social liberalism. Each had its own analysis of how society should be protected, and as important, from whom. It took almost 2 decades of grinding despair, clashes in the streets, fascist genocide, and a world war before a new consensus was built around a new regime of social protection, variously called the post-war settlement, the social state, or social liberalism. Now, Polanyi's work reminds us that the failure of a governing formula unleashes myriad political imaginaries, some progressive, some regressive, and some simply pathological. The indignance in Spain, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Quebec student strike, the retail riots in the UK, the American Tea Party, the rising popularity of xenophobic nationalism, and indeed nascent fascism in Europe in the form of the National Front in France or Golden Dawn in Greece. These are all examples of counter-movements. These movements could not be more different, but they share a common point of departure. Their analysis goes something like this. The system is broken. Political elites will not or cannot fix the problem. Ordinary people, variously defined, need protection, and they're not getting it. This is a volatile mix, and all of us have a critical investment in how the obvious and growing need for social protection is resolved in the current era. Now, the final kind of touchstone to the 1930s is an eroding elite consensus on the governing paradigm. Many international financial institutions and dominant and prominent economists who once championed market governance now disavow both its assumptions and its outcomes. For example, Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz recently wrote that market governance was always a grab bag of ideas based on the fundamentalist notion that markets are self-correcting and allocate resources effectively and serve the public interest well. This grab bag, he continues, was a political doctrine always, serving particular interests. And it was never supported by either economic theory or historical experience. Jeffrey Sachs, another defector, argues that the U.S. has been deprived of social trust, honesty, and compassion. The economic crisis, in other words, is a moral crisis. The World Economic Forum and the OECD also appear to have changed their minds. The World Economic Forum's 2012 Global Risks Report warns of a dystopian future for much of humanity. It emphasizes that the future is marked by chronic and high levels of unemployment and indebted governments that are unable to pay for their social programs. It warns about growing nationalism and populism and the emergence of what it calls critical, fragile states. I know it's really depressing. Critical, fragile states are formerly wealthy countries that descend into lawlessness and unrest because they cannot or will not take care of intergenerational inequalities or tackle severe income disparities. Last December, the OECD issued a scathing report called Divided We Stand, and in it, it pronounced in capital letters the benefits of economic growth do not trickle down automatically, and greater inequality does not foster social mobility. Our policies, the OECD concludes, have created a system that makes inequalities grow and that it's time for a new approach, focused on employment, tax reform, education, health, and families. The report concludes with a single recommendation for all governments. It's time to go social. So social ways of seeing. The idea of the social is a formative thread that weaves through both the development of liberal democracies and the social sciences. We tend to assume that the idea of the social has always been with us, but as relatively recent invention, an idea about dealing with our shared fate. The term was born in the Enlightenment, marking man off from fate, nature, and the otherworldly. People began to explore life in a complex society, but as Polanyi explains, it was pauperism that fixed attention on the incomprehensible fact that poverty seemed to go with plenty. This revelation, he says, was as powerful as the most spectacular events of history. Social, not technical invention was the intellectual mainspring of the Industrial Revolution. Industrial societies began to develop what Gertrude Himmelfarb calls a moral imagination. The idea of the social also was the launching point for the social sciences. Their professional mission, as Burway puts it, was to find some order in the broken fragments of modernity and to salvage the promise of progress. Social scientists introduced such core concepts as social structure, stratification, equality, systemic cause, and human well-being into the political lexicon, and progressively set down the foundation for what Margaret Summers called a sociological-driven knowledge culture. From the outset, this knowledge culture could not and did not separate its scholarly enterprise from its ethical moorings. The social way of seeing then crystallized in the 1930s. The years leading up to the crash were also marked by profound income inequalities. And social scientists like R.H. Tawney were one of the first to ring the warning bells. In his 1931 book, Inequality, Tawney argued, democracy is an inherently unstable system unless it is also committed to the elimination of all forms of special privilege and the taming of economic power. During these same years, Lord Beveridge, who drew up the blueprint for the British social state, wrote about the 5 evils of market governance: squalor, ignorance, want, idleness, and disease. The Great Depression also motivated Canadian social scientists to critically engage with a failing economy and a failing philosophy of governance. In 1932, for example, academics from McGill and the U of T launched the League for Social Reconstruction, and the pillories of that early intellectual work through the Regina Manifesto, the Royal Commission on Dominion Provincial Relations, and the Marsh Report. Leonard Marsh was a student of Lord Beveridge and came to Canada in 1930 after being hired as director of social research at McGill University, where he conducted research on unemployment and economic mobility. His 1943 report to the federal government provided the logic for Canada's post-war social system. The basic soundness of social insurance, he wrote, is that it's underwritten by the community as a whole. So, post-war social regimes were simply one enactment, one translation of this sociologically driven knowledge culture that took root in that period. And as feminists and critical race and Aboriginal scholars have since established, the ambitions of social liberalism were never fully achieved. But they did provide a basis for a new social literacy, a way to contest entrenched social hierarchies and to gnaw away at social inequalities. So what do I mean when I say social literacy? As I say, the term does not refer to a set of policies, but instead to the core commitments that inspire protective strategies. In social literacy is irreducibly relational, emphasizing our mutual interdependence. The literacy refers to a proficiency, a way of seeing, a way of reading social relations. And my research indicates that social literacy revolved around 4 core commitments. First, a commitment to the primacy of democracy over all forms of political fatalism, including market fundamentalism. Governments, meaning people, can and should intervene in markets because they are inherently unstable and because they are political creations. Second, a commitment to the idea of shared fate, that everybody's life course, regardless of failure, risk, success, are shaped by forces beyond the individual's control. Third, a commitment to social rights, broadly defined as public goods and as a necessary part of democratic societies. Political rights mean nothing if people are constrained by poverty or the indignities of prejudice. Political and social rights need each other to survive. And finally, a commitment to social justice as an always, already unfinished promise. The social field is a field of contestation and an open space where systemic discrimination and social exclusion are contested and more equitable futures sought. So these core commitments, I think, have been subdued in recent years, but they have not been forgotten. Not since the 1930s has there been a greater need for social scientists to help develop social literacy. But our disciplines are under siege on a variety of fronts. Market governments dismiss our research as irrelevant. Shrinking arts funding and faculties convey the message to students, academics, and the broader public alike that the social disciplines are momentarily tolerated but ultimately expendable. Innovative and critical scholarship is less likely to be funded or published in so-called top-drawer journals. Media commentators level stinging critiques at social research for being pie in the sky. Some critics, however, condemn the social disciplines for not being progressive enough. Chris Hedges, who talks here tomorrow, admonishes intellectuals for abandoning their historic role of speaking truth to power. Hedges argues that the American liberal class was seduced by the utopian promises of globalization and market governance, and by the trappings of power which were conferred on those who bowed to the new orthodoxy. Hedges argues that our disciplines discredited and silenced critics within their own ranks and then succumbed to opportunism, all the while betraying a growing public struggling for inclusion or simply to make ends meet. The liberal class lost its moral autonomy, it lost its allies in the broader community, it betrayed others as it betrayed itself, and is now a victim of its own complicity. I think Hedges' critique resonates with the experiences of many critical researchers in recent years. But do these charges really capture the issues of academic accountability and social illiteracy at the moment? Can we really come to grips with our uncertain world without first interrogating the profoundly antisocial instincts of market-driven governance? Not likely. Neoliberalism is often used as a shorthand for the sea change in policies that came and took root globally in the 1980s. Political economists continue to debate about how best to understand neoliberalism, but most agree that it is an unrelenting antisocial doctrine. For more than a generation, our discourses and research have been cleansed. As Hall and Massey argue, the public interest, public ownership, common good, equality, redistribution of wealth, stubborn facts of poverty, all became unspeakable. It's paradoxical, I think, to say the least, that the social sciences have in part been sidelined by a branch of the social sciences, neoclassical economics. Its governing principles were roundly rejected in the aftermath of laissez-faire. During the stagflation of the 1970s, however, international policy networks and the governing class grasped onto the solutions of neoclassical economics. armed with the alleged certainties of statistical modeling and rational choice theories, economics forgot its roots in political economy and moral philosophy and became more and more intolerant of perspectives in teaching and research appointments and publications that contradicted its mantra. Economics established itself as having technical supremacy in the social sciences by its own standards. It claimed that its theories and its models were universal and limitless in application. We were asked to accept as an article of faith this statistical maxim that all other things being equal, even when our theories, our research, and our experience told us precisely the opposite. We were asked to buy into the false premise that economic growth is a precondition for the realization of social goals rather than the reverse. And all of this unfolded under a veil of moral obtuseness. The social was written out of the governing equation. In 1935, John Maynard Keynes wrote that practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. I think we have been set adrift by the fatalistic scribblers that told us that markets were self-regulating and that markets would raise all the boats in the harbor. These scribblers said that markets behaved best when left alone. Politics had no business in business. But if recent experience has taught us anything, it is precisely that. Markets are, by definition, political creations. They are made and remade through politics to advance the interests of a few or to advance the interests of the many. We also bear the weight of neoliberal scribblings that tell us that individuals must be self-sufficient market actors who, as such, bear full responsibility for themselves, their families, and their futures. The incessant rhetoric and politics of individualization place steeply rising demands on everybody to find personal causes and personal remedies, what Beck terms biographic solutions, to what are in effect shared social challenges. The list of these challenges is long and growing. Income disparities, racial inequalities, intergenerational inequalities, inaccessible education, childcare, elderly care, climate change, environmental degradation. Hacker calls this the great risk shift, where more and more economic risk is downloaded onto the fragile balance sheets of individuals. Now, the problem with this formulation is not that individuals and families do not try to find solutions. They have no other choice but to try. Rather, the problem is, as Bauman explains, is that the very formulation of a biographic solution to a systemic contradiction is an oxymoron. It can be sought, but it cannot be found. The source and solution of our many problems lay beyond the grasp of the individual. The knowledge and the resources that we bring to our life choices, in other words, are not a matter of choice. The inescapable paradox of individualization, then, is that it is a collective condition. Almost everybody is in the same boat, expected to chart their own course on treacherous waters without a compass and without a life jacket. Nothing has trickled down except perhaps insecurity and inequality. So now I turn to the production of social illiteracy. It has been 50 years since Thomas Kuhn wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In it, he described how scientific paradigms eventually collapse under the weight of their own failures and their incapacity to grapple with new problems. Old ways of intervening in the world become discredited, but they live on, sometime as a zombie-like entity, living yet dead. Kuhn says it often takes a new generation to break with the stale mindsets and closed organizational hierarchies of the past. But in politics, such challenges are strongly resisted by those in power. It's far easier to try to change the subject or shoot the messenger. In short, to manufacture social illiteracy. In the United States, we now hear terms like rancid populism and junk politics, which are used to describe the political rhetoric that breeds contempt for science and experts and fuels antagonisms among different social groups. In Canada, too, we have our fair share of junk politics, which pits the taxpayer and the job creator against immigrants, academics, the poor, equity seekers, public sector workers, any and all who can be represented as dependent on the public sector. These are false and forced distinctions. We are all job creators when we fund public goods and public services and when we redistribute income. To be sure, we need a strong private sector and the jobs that it can create. But we must never forget that the private sector thrives on a physical, social, and intellectual foundation which were built and maintained by ordinary taxpayers who believed in public goods. Poll after poll continue to show that Canadians support fair taxation for public services. A few years ago, I wrote about the 3 Ds: discrediting the messenger and the message, dismantling organizational infrastructures, and disappearance from public discourse. And I use those 3 terms to describe how the equity agenda was taken out of Canadian politics. We now see the 3D agenda being applied to an ever wider spectrum of civil society groups. The discrediting of these groups has been relentless. They're labeled as special interest, radicals, opponents of growth, of the Canadian way, even as money launderers and dupes of foreign interests. They are also dismantled. Organizations devoted to poverty, race relations, Aboriginal health, immigrant settlement, the environment, the list goes on, have been defunded, their books audited, and their charitable status interrogated. The systematic leveling of civil society groups is unprecedented, but the reason for their exile, advocacy activities, gnaws at the heart of our democracy. Advocacy is a necessary part of democratic pluralism. Shooting the messenger intimidates and silences those who want or need to stay out of the line of fire. But shooting the messenger, and we should have no doubt about this, impoverishes us all. The disappearance of social knowledge, however, is, I think, the most critical challenge to scholarship for these uncertain times. Social science funding has declined. Researchers have been subject to various forms of conditionality. Social policy branches in government have been shut down. Research reports have been censored and shelved. And government scientists have been prevented from sharing their research with the public. Disappearance also underlies the cancellation of the long-form census and the progressive suppression of social data that has followed in the wake of this unprecedented decision. All kinds of data, ranging from climate measurement in the Arctic to surveys of people with disabilities, have been terminated. And now, under the banner of austerity, Stats Canada budget has been cut in half and half of its staff been put on notice. This can only result in fewer surveys, less data, and less analysis. Funding has also been eliminated for the National Council of Welfare, First Nations Statistical Council, the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. All disappeared. Now, the destruction of such critical sources of social knowledge promises to save Canadian taxpayers in the realm of $50 million. A substantial figure, to be sure, but I dare say less than the cost of a single wing on an F-35 fighter jet. And let's be clear, as this age of austerity begins to unfold, cuts are not the same as savings. Who benefits from the suppression of social data? Who bears the costs? I think we all do. Social statistics are a vital part of social literacy and social knowledge production. These data help us measure our progress towards collective goals, to compare well-being amongst diverse groups and across regions and across countries and across time. Social data and social analysis are yardsticks that enable citizens, civil society groups, and governments to track indicators of social integrity, including gaps between the rich and the rest. These data also play a critical role in breaking down barriers for disadvantaged groups. Equity-seeking groups have to be able to make their case, not the least through reliable census data, that they have been denied full inclusion in Canadian society and on that basis seek redress. But most critically, social data subvert political agendas, especially those that conceal growing inequalities in our political landscape. As researchers, we have to ask the obvious question: how can we inform Canadians about changing social needs, or indeed contribute to evidence-based policy making with outdated or insufficient information? We can't. As citizens, we all must ask, how can we have any confidence in public pronouncements and public policies which are formulated with unreliable data or no data at all? We simply can't. And more pointedly, how are we to understand any government that would prefer not to know how its citizens are faring in this great recession? Canadians have a right to know how they're doing, both in comparison with other countries and in earlier times. They have a right to know whether policy interventions are working. Suppressing the message and the messenger, however, is ultimately a pointless politics. The problems do not disappear. The insecurities we face in our daily lives, rampant inequality, poisoned environments are here for all of us to see. Canada's plummeting position on so many international social and environmental rankings also cannot be hidden. The genie, indeed, is out of the bottle. So before I sum up, the Trudeau Foundation asks us a bit to talk about our personal journey, how we got into the business, in my case, political science, and why we study the things we do. And this task is a lot harder than it may appear at first glance. So much of our lives is shaped by serendipity. Over the course of a career, some doors open, other doors close, and some, of course, get slammed in our face. And unlike researchers in the physical sciences who devote their entire career to the discovery of a gene or a distant star or a cure, the job of the social scientist is necessarily reflexive. The objects of our analysis, the social and the political, are in constant flux. I can say that I was always interested in politics. I was raised in a small town, in fact, not too far from here, in Alice Munro's Ontario of the 1950s and 60s. My mother and father were deeply involved in the community. A newspaper was always there at the start of the day and the CBC News at dinner time. And my sisters and I were infused with the idea that community engagement mattered and politics mattered. And we took our partisan politics very seriously back then, especially since my family was always on the wrong side of my small town's political fence. But although partisanship ignited my interest in politics, it did not sustain it. Instead, it was the open-ended promise of advancing social equality and social justice through politics, what I've called social literacy, that propelled me into political science. My formative years were indelibly shaped by the struggles of the American civil rights movement, by the early rumblings of the feminist movement, and by Pierre Trudeau's idea of a just society. Now, of course, Trudeau's legalized notion of social justice was criticized from the outset. For example, by Cree scholar Harold Cardinal, who immediately wrote a book called Unjust Society, which fleshed out the realities of Canada's First Nations. Feminist and critical race scholars also pointed out that liberal equality rights were not enough to dislodge entrenched social hierarchies, but the idea of a just society had been introduced into the conversation. So, for a teenage girl in Alice Munro's Ontario, Trudeau's declaration that Canada must be a just society resonated deeply. And so did his definition of politics as a series of decisions to create that society. So, to borrow a line from Barack Obama, I was all fired up and ready to go into political science. So you can imagine my surprise when on the first day of Politics 101, my professor told me that politics was a system with inputs, outputs, feedback loops, and moreover, that the idea of social justice more properly fit under the umbrella of philosophy, where questions of what if were rightly entertained. But with many more political science courses and many great teachers to whom I owe so much, I began to understand that politics is always the enactment of somebody's idea of what if. Like, what if we let the market be the sole arbiter of social life? As Robert Cox once said, theory is always for someone for some purpose. The social sciences have a lot to say about this economic crisis and the profound inequalities and insecurities with which we live. I began this lecture by recounting the recommendations of influential global policy networks to go social. There's also a growing body of solid social science research which tells us that equitable societies almost always do better on all matter of indicators, ranging from education to social mobility to crime rates to health outcomes. Social researchers also tell us that income inequality was an underlying cause of the Great Recession, and that without reinvestment, social investments, the economy won't recover. Other comparative analysis demonstrate that social justice and economic performance are in fact complementary. These findings are based on hard empirical data and sound social science research. Now, the social sciences can't provide an instant or ready-made solution for the complex and interconnected problems that confront us. Neither should we. They call for informed debate that is so threatened by the discrediting, displacement, and disappearance of politics that we currently experience. Our job is precisely to work with diverse publics and governments to analyze and, yes, criticize public policies and social practices that thwart a sustainable future. Scholarship for an uncertain world demands the free flow of ideas and democratic conversations which ignite imaginations about the possibilities of working together to solve our shared problems. To paraphrase Northrop Frye, the fundamental job of the social imagination is to produce, out of the society we have to live in, a vision of the society we want to live in. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions. Si vous voulez poser des questions, veuillez utiliser les micros placés à chaque côté de la salle. That was a terrific talk, Janine.
Thank you.
And I'm sure there are going to be all sorts of questions on a wide range of topics and you know, the importance of social data in doing evidence-based research and developing evidence-based policy. The idea that politics is always the enactment of someone's what-if question. The importance of equity and equitable societies in social justice. If I could just take the liberty of asking the first question, I guess I'm curious how the cultural diversification of Canadian society and the changing locations, regional locations of power and opportunity within Canadian society also play into this question of social literacy, illiteracy, and the challenges ahead?
Well, I think you'd be surprised. We've heard a lot in political rhetoric these days about, Ontario versus Alberta and, killing the economy and these kinds of tensions about pulling away at contradictions between where people live or various possibilities, different possibilities of potentially realizing social goals, that some governments have more capacity than others and so on. I think what's really remarkable is that when you poll people, you do a national poll, there are predictably some regional variations, but the regional variations are very small. I mean, Quebec tends to be more social, and surprisingly, Alberta tends to be less social. But the majority of Canadians strongly support social programs. They're simply not being talked to. And they're just simply be saying, well, we're not going to talk about these aren't on the agenda. There was a poll done just only this March, where 80% of Canadians, and this is an Environics poll, 80% of Canadians said that government should do something about income inequality. And I think one of the reasons why that is so is that, previously, for the vast middle class, poverty and inequality were something that were, on the other side of the track. Mm-hmm. But now it's our children who are locked into precarious employment, who can't get a job, who are living in the basement. People are feeling these inequalities. They're much more directly part of their experience than they think they have been in a long time. Mm-hmm. And I think that also is a similarity to the Great Depression. Right. So I think that if I understand your question, there are regional differences. I think a lot of those differences are played up politically. If you want to talk about the recent controversy about the oil sands and the Dutch disease, if you ask Canadians in polling as well, they're strongly supportive of environmental sustainability. But all of these questions, I said that social has been written out of political discourse, and I think it's time for social science and the media to start writing it back in because people are experiencing it.
Okay, great. Well, we have questioners at both microphones. Let's start over on right. Please let us know who you are.
My name is Zhuan Chen. I'm with the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. It's not like every day I can get to ask a question face-to-face to a speaker of your caliber, so please excuse me to take full advantage to exercise my candidness. I'm hearing that you said we should, a recommendation is probably to go social. I am wondering, are you afraid to just to use the word socialist or socialism? Because, well, if anyone comes to me and challenges me and say, well, socialism has been experimented, that the Soviet Union has failed, well, I probably tell them that, well, it's never been really a socialist state to start with. I mean, the first thing that the Bolsheviks took power was to dismantle all the socialist economic institutions in Soviet Union. So, do you have a comment on that? I mean, I don't think we should be afraid to just embrace a wider spectrum of ideological debates when we talk about political issues. I mean, capitalism is the reason that gets you into this quagmire, and you can think around with the system. But should we embrace just more,
Well, I mean, I think it's important that some of these theoretical positions get discussed again. But I think that I'll probably get shot for this. But I think that the kind of traditional conceptions of socialism were very much grew out of a particular historical experience of early industrialization and spoke to particular kinds of issues. And if you, for example, looked at the socialist movements of those periods, they're highly sexist, racist, all of those kinds of things. We have all kinds of different issues, not the least of which is the relevance of the nation in the globe and how all of that interconnectedness comes. So I'd like to make a distinction between social protection and all kinds of different kinds of socialism. So that's my primary concern. And I'm quite happy that living with liberal democracy, if we in fact have some kind of regime of social protection which is inclusive, but which most importantly is democratically established. I think that the problem is, and what I was trying to allude to in my talk, is that if we don't begin to speak about our problems in the way that you suggest, that these are social problems, these are shared problems, it's our connected, shared fate, that we deal with these issues. If we don't start talking about those things, then the frustration gets mobilized by different kinds of discourses, which say that, the immigrants are doing it, or some kind of blame politics or fascist politics, which can mobilize people who are not allowed to place their personal frustrations in a broader conception of social protection.
All right, we'll rotate.
Thank you for your wonderful talk, Janine. It was really inspiring. At its center, I saw this image of the sociability of ideas beating against the barricades of a self-insulated ignorance economy. It seemed to be one way of looking at the tensions you were looking at. And I was reminded of a wonderful line in Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation about getting the small things right on the way to a great mistake. I wonder if you'd reflect on the implications of that line.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great book, and I go back to it all the time. I can't remember that line, but I'll go searching for it. It's funny, because that's essentially what complexity theory says, right? That the small things are the most complicated. The larger things are more simple. And I think that, when we think about that, and I'm just talking off the top of my head on this one, but I mean, when we think about alternatives to globalization or to neoliberalism, and we have to admit that on every indicator, it is a failed system of governance. I mean, there's not one place where we can say, oh, well, we did well on that one. And what the alternative is, could be, in fact, things that are very small, and those things are starting already, like eating local, having kind of more localized rather than globalized, so that, the alternative to the discourse that, globalization is inevitable. Well, of course, that all depended on oil, didn't it? And we've hit the point of peak oil, so we have to rethink what social good or common good or social protection means. And that could be something very small. Yeah.
To this side.
Hi, my name is Matthew Brett. I'm a student at Concordia University. I'd actually like to propose to the facilitator if we could also perhaps alternate between male and female speakers. It's very common, it's just a proposal, but I'd be happy to cede my spot to anybody else who would like to speak.
As you wish. I want to get all 5 of the speakers in.
Okay.
So what I was going to propose, as time is marching on, is that you ask your question, and then perhaps we get all of the remaining speakers to pose their questions at once and allow Janine to answer them in that way.
Sorry, but
We just lost a minute.
sometimes people should be called on what they say. I was very moved by your talk. In fact, I feel could suppress breaking down in great wails over the basic tragedy of the situation. And one is, but I was thinking about specifically the academics. They're having the grounds, their actual tools being cut out right from underneath them through this destruction of knowledge. And you would think that they would be, of course, marching in the streets along with the people in Montreal. And I was wondering if what I see, I'm Ann Dyer with the Ford. I'm a PhD student. I live with an academic and I know a lot of academics. And I'm wondering if the intensity of the work of scholars right now, and the fact that a lot of it's done by low-paid people who don't have much room to move, if that's being sort of the reason why scholars are not really banging the drums in a more loud way, and particularly, sorry, there was an important point there. The university is being flooded with all these students that, have modest interest in what's going on. And is that a strategy, in fact, by a government? Like, just keep shoving those students in there so fast that nobody has a moment to think. I wonder if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, that's it's a complicated question, and in fact, because of the theme of this conference, Scholarship for an Uncertain World, I've heard that question variously framed in different sessions. I think that there's two things that academics have to think about. And first I would say that as well, academics are in the streets in Montreal. And yesterday, in fact, the legal profession was out to fight against the, I can't remember the number of the bill, but the one, 78, okay. Academics have a lot of need for reflection about how universities have been restructured, both in terms of what you're saying, in terms of workload. But I think much more critically, and I'll go into kind of a Foucauldian moment, if you'll forgive me, but in terms of the governmentality of universities, how the conduct of conduct, so that we have been so disciplined and increasingly disciplined to publish our research in particular places, to go through peer review processes which weed out critical work, that weed out critical scholars, top-ranked journals. Well, come on. Do a sociological analysis of what those top-ranked journals are. A lot of the creative research is simply ruled out. So that's one kind of broader question about how universities govern themselves. And I think as academics, we have to kind of look inside and say, when we're sitting on, adjudication committees or whatever, let's be reflective of what this process is doing. And in fact, let's be reflective of how, citation counting and all that makes us absolutely irrelevant to the broader community. And so, on the one hand, you hear these kind of logic about, it's quality control and this, and the space that is being controlled gets smaller and smaller. So I think that we have to, as academics, really think about how we have been put on a wheel which governs ourselves in a way that makes us irrelevant to the broader community. And that means for university administrators and for colleagues and for university strategic plans to really be serious when they say things like outreach, or at my university, it's uplifting the whole people. Well, let's start uplifting the whole people. The XX journal of whatever is not going to do that. So that's one thing. I think that there's a lot of critical work that has to be done by academics themselves. On the other hand, I think that in a way, there's this huge space for academics because of social media. And I think that if you saw during the last election, for example, there were all kinds of things. I got social media sites that were, coming up in Facebook. They keep coming up again and again. It's a huge window for academics to do kind of critical education, right? Not even to be on one side or the other, but say critical education about kind of pulling back what some of these discourses and the implications of those discourses. And I had a third point and I've forgotten it. Okay.
Okay, now unfortunately we are over time here at this point. So what I'd like to propose to do is that the questioners just very briefly, the remaining questioners, pose their questions. If you feel that you would like to answer one or some of them right now, we can. Otherwise, there's a reception taking place afterwards, and perhaps the conversation can continue there. So very briefly, please.
I was hoping if you'd be able to offer some advice for educators or people in the room taking an issue like the tar sands, which I'm sure you must deal with, that's so complex and ecological and social, and how we might go about responding to young people or other people that make it unidimensional and only talk about the market forces involved or the economic issues around it, because there seems to be this weightedness to that argument that that's what really matters, and all these other issues are kind of like, that's just the single voice, you talking about that.
Yeah.
Do you want to get them all?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Go ahead.
Bonjour. Est-ce que je peux poser ma question en français? Ou...
Oui, absolument.
Oui, OK. Je voulais aussi faire référence au mouvement étudiant qu'il y a au Québec. Moi, je demeure à Québec même, ce qui est un peu différent de Montréal. Hein. Dans ce mouvement-là, au début, c'était une question de droit de scolarité. À un moment donné, on a de plus en plus entendu parler de justice sociale. Mais les médias, et je pense là aux médias traditionnels ou aux médias commerciaux, ont beaucoup alimenté ce débat. La télé, les journaux, la radio. Et on sait que les relations entre le milieu académique ou scientifique et les médias est souvent compliquée, difficile. Mais c'est dommage, parce que là, ce qui passe dans les médias, c'est un discours très simpliste. Les étudiants se font traiter de communistes ou de hippies, et les informations sont minimes. J'aurais aimé, si vous avez une idée, la connaître sur le rôle des médias traditionnels, pas des médias sociaux, des médias traditionnels, dans la déconstruction, dans comment vous avez dit, illiteracy, dans la construction de l'illittératie.
Yeah.
Okay, and the last two questions?
Yeah, just a very quick announcement as well.
Can we just get to the question, please? We're really out of time.
Okay, I'll be quick. At 8 p.m. tonight, I'll be very quick. At 8 p.m. tonight, there's a rally. There's 35 simultaneous rallies taking place across Canada at 8 p.m. tonight. The rally tonight is taking place at Kitchener City Hall, and I'll be handing out flyers at the main exit for those interested in coming. And my question to you is, we live in a system that necessarily entails growth, relentless, constant growth. And I think at best, the social can distribute that growth more evenly. Given that this is the Big Thinking series, my question is, can we envision a model that doesn't necessarily entail growth? And can you maybe provide some outlines of that? Thank you.
Okay, and the last question?
The political suppression of the social can also be seen in education curriculum, and I work in sustainability education, an online program with Conestoga and Algonquin colleges. So we work to train all types of educators to integrate sustainability across their curriculum. And so my question is about if you have case studies, either at a policy level or at an individual teacher level, where teachers are able to counteract these political trends that we're talking about in terms of teaching young people, people of all ages, to be more engaged to rebuild civil society and citizen engagement and social capital.
So I don't know if you want to try to tackle any of those or think about it and take them on in the reception. So
I've forgotten what the first question was.
the first question was about the tar sands.
I think that, in a way, as I said before, how much time do I have? That the genie is out of the bottle on this. Even if they make arguments about the tar sands, and I'm from Alberta, and it's obviously critically important to the Alberta economy and to the Canadian economy. But at the same time, they can't continue to develop the tar sands in the way that they have, and that's totally unregulated. And I think that that's catching up to them, and that Alberta might be at a point where they won't be able to sell their oil, and that's not in too far a future if they don't clean up their act. And so I think that, there's the economic case, but there's also an environmental case, which is also an economic case. And that's the response that I would have to the question about economic growth. What kind of economic growth? We can have incredible economic growth by technology and manufacture of sustainable environment technology. And so, there are different ways to think about economic growth. For the question about the media, it's a huge problem. It's part of the problem, part of the solution. I think it, at this point, is part of the solution, or the problem, but can be part of the solution because the media is very reflective of things that glitter. And so if we start to glitter, if there are, you can just even see with the Quebec student case how the reporting has changed from, silly students who don't know how good it's getting, because they've got the cheapest tuition in Canada, to, perhaps they have a case here and maybe it has far more to do with the cost of tuition. And so I think, however, when you were talking about the communists and so on, standing on corners, giving out pamphlets and so on, the capacity for social media is so huge. And so I think that there are real opportunities for building social literacy in that way. And I think there's like a huge hunger out there for people to try to understand the problems that they're having in ways that are alternatives to this kind of individualization. Because if, in fact, there's this kind of dominant model that you're responsible for yourself and your family, and don't ask us for help, that creates frustration. It creates shame. It creates all kinds of things, and people, I think, are really anxious to hear that they are part of a shared problem. And I think that's why we're at such a crucial point, because those people, Chomsky said something about the American Tea Party. He said, don't be critical of the people in the American Tea Party, because these are honest, hardworking people who have seen their status and their opportunities in life drop for 30 years. So he said that they listen to the Becks and the Palins of the world because they're offering solutions. They may be crazy solutions, but they're solutions. And so we have to be in there kind of offering, hopefully, slightly less crazy solutions.
Before I ask you to join me in thanking Janine, let me rephrase that. Before I ask you again to join me in thanking Janine Brodie, qu'il me soit permis de remercier encore une fois la Fondation Trudeau pour l'attachement démontré au cycle de conférences à voix grande. Nous sommes toujours reconnaissants du soutien des partenariats qu'elle nous accorde à l'occasion de ces manifestations. Je vous remercie. Thank all of you for coming today. The cliché that I'm sure we all heard early on in university is it's great when you can have a talk that provokes more questions than answers. certainly we know that that's the case today. That was a terrific talk, Janine. Thank you very much. Very good question and answer period. Thank you to the audience, and perhaps we can continue these conversations outside in the hall. For those of you who are interested or may want to let other people know about the talks, most of the Big Thinking lectures are being videotaped and will be available in podcast soon. Now, please join me again in thanking Janine Brodie.